My name's Terry Novetsky. I had the privilege of being a Rav Lichtenstein share in Tavshin Mem Aleph. I want to express my appreciation to Rav Amichai Gordon for conceiving this virtual public forum to highlight the importance of Kedushat Aviv and its rightful place in Shulchan Torah, and also my friend Norm Shalit and Yoel Weiss and Yonatan Shai Friedman, who are working so hard on putting together the English version of this program. Kedushat Aviv is divided into two sections. Kedushat Zman, Rav Lichtenstein's remarkable presentations on classic topics such as Shabbos, Yom Tov, Yom Kippur, and Kedushat Makom, which also contains some classic discussions, including on Eretz Yisrael and Yerushalayim. But the framework of Kedushat Makom is based in the first parak of Maseches Kelim, the Eser Kedushos that are stated there. And one of those cases, the issue that we will be discussing today, Kedushat Ayarot Mukafot Choma, is an outlier of sorts, and one would imagine that arguably the entire discussion could have been skipped. First of all, it's never, shockingly, it's never discussed in the Gemara at all. It's an outlier in the Mishnah because the Mishnah is it's describing Kedusha emanating and expanding in concentric circles from Kodshei Kodashim outward. But that's not applicable to Ayarot Mukafot Choma, and therefore it's not within the same discussion. If you peruse Torah, which I did this morning, there are thousands and thousands of entries on Shabbat and Yom Tov. But other than Ayarot Mukafot Choma in the context of Shushan Purim, there's not a single shir. So nonetheless, I think we're quite fortunate, if not blessed, with this article for two reasons. First of all, it provides an insight into Rav Lichtenstein's focus and ideology in confronting Talmud Torah. He was an Eved Hashem, and therefore Torah was not about entertainment. All Torah was of incalculable value. But second, there's a certain wonderment we experience specifically when Rav Lichtenstein discusses esoteric subjects such as this, because it identifies so clearly his derech halimud, his creativity in articulating and formulating a structure and approach towards any sugya. And therefore, when you read this article, you would think it was as if he were discussing the second parak in Bava Metzia, even though there's literally no basis for that you could find in any sefer whatsoever with respect to this topic. So let's go to that very methodology. And here in this article, it shows in the same way. First, he seeks to identify the foundational basis of a halacha. And then he looks to Rishonim to provide the possible conceptual understandings of that sugya. And then once he identifies that those possible conceptual understandings, he then applies it on a more expansive basis to related subject matter. In this case, he applies it to the famous discussion, the Machlokas Rambam and Rav with respect to Kedusha Shaita, Kedusha Lotzi Lavo, as well as in this case to an expansion of understanding how Arei Choma are treated in connection, their reestablishment of the Kedusha. Is it identical with, parallel to, or an exception of Yovel? Should we understand it within that context? So in looking in that larger tapestry, I want to first, before going to the article, identify a number of basic halachos that Rav Lichtenstein presumes the reader is familiar with. The first is, as expressed in the 7th parak of Hilchos Beis Bechira in the Gemara in Zvachim, the machnot. There are 3 machnot in the Midbar, Machna Yisrael, Levia, and Machna Shechina, and they have parallels within Yerushalayim. Machna Yisrael the parallel is to Yerushalayim. Machna Levia is HaRav, and Machna Shechina is the Azara itself. Now, obviously, each one of those 3 groupings have subgroupings. It's not just the Azara, it's Kodesh, Kodashim, it's the Azarot. Each one has subsections, but it's those 3 machanot that are utilized within the halacha for defining certain isurim and also certain benefits. By way of example, in Yerushalayim, in HaRav and the Azara, it's aser, it's an iser in the Torah through a drasha. Drasha of lo yavo el tocha machna, which is actually talking about masa milchama, the machna milchama in Parshas Kitzetzei, but the Gemara in Zvachim learns that one cannot enter into HaRav, and certainly not the Azara, when one is tamei. That doesn't apply to Yerushalayim. What does apply to Yerushalayim, which is a separate drasha, is mitzorim. That a mitzora cannot enter into, or must exit from Yerushalayim more precisely. The source of that is actually a little bit less defined, but there is a special pasuk of Badal Yeshev, within Parshas Mitzara, and that applies. So that's the Isser that applies to Yerushalayim. The benefit is the ability to eat Kadshe Kalim in Yerushalayim, and Kadshe Kadashim are only eaten in the Azara. So that's the first thing, the machnos. The second point that I wanted to set out is a specific Isser known as Isser Yotzei. This also is in Gemara Zvachim Daf Tzamaches, and in Rambam Hilchos Masa Korbanos in Parak Aleph, which is Basar Kadshe Kadashim. That meat, if it exits the Azara, it's nifsal, and also considered nasa katrefa in the words of the Rambam. That applies the same thing to basar kachekalim. If you remove it from Yerushalayim, it becomes nifsal and cannot be, and it's also considered to be trefa. So now let's start with our understanding and discussion of the article on Kedushat Ayarot Mukafot Choma. The Mishnah Maseches Kelim reads as follows: Ayarot Mukafot Choma mikudashos mimena. That the Ayarot Mukafot Choma have a more intense kedusha than Eretz Yisrael generally. Shemashlichim mitochem etzem mitzorim, because the mitzorim have to be removed. So the question is, on what basis? Remember, it's not mentioned in the Gemara. It's not a pasuk in the Torah. So on what basis does that arrive? So the Rash on that Mishnah states as follows: V'kidish Yehoshua's Ayarot Mukafot Choma, that Yehoshua created a special status of Kedusha to these cities, B'Kedushas Machna Yisrael. It is the same as Machna Yisrael, which is in our example, in our general introduction, Machna Yisrael means Yerushalayim, that it has the same status as Yerushalayim. This doesn't apply to Eretz Yisrael generally. Just these specific cities, that are Mukafot Choma, from the time of Yehoshua ben Nun, these specific cities have, according to the Rash, Kedushat's Machne Yisrael. They have an equivalency to Yerushalayim. But if they're equivalent to Yerushalayim, we're saying that in the negative. But how about in the affirmative? Meaning, can you eat Kadshe Kalim? Because that would be the parallel affirmative status of Machne Yisrael. So here the Rash raises the issue, but it's really developed in the Kiryas Sefer by the Mabit, and he answers in a certain way, shockingly, yes. He says, yes, in fact, theoretically, you could eat Kadshe Kalim, but only theoretically, because if you remove it from Yerushalayim, it becomes Asur. Okay, it becomes Asur because of the Isser Yotze. So, although theoretically you could eat Kadshe Kalim in Arei Mukafot Choma, why? Because it has the same status, equivalent status, Yerushalayim as Machne Yisrael, and as a result, it is identical with respect to Kadshe Kalim, and he even theorizes that, let's take if it were Yericho. If Yericho extended and Yerushalayim extended, and their walls became adjacent to each other, then theoretically, if you wouldn't violate this or Yotze, you could eat Kadshe Kalim in Machne Yisrael. This is the position of the Mabit. V'nira dekeben de midioraisa hayu Machne Yisrael Ayarot Mukafot Choma. Since from the Torah perspective, Ayarot Mukafot Choma is Machne Yisrael. Afilu linyan Kadshe Kalim shenacholim b'chol Machne Yisrael nami. Ilav mishum diika hefsek ben Yerushalayim la'Ayarot Mukafot Choma. Meaning, like, theoretically you could eat it. However, technically you can't because of the Yisur Yotze. Rav Lichtenstein said that the Mabit's argument probably extends too far, because you can argue that that according to the Rash, that these Ayarot Mukafot Choma have status of Machne Yisrael, while still acknowledging the uniqueness of Machne Shivtech Olamim of Yerushalayim, and saying that's the basis upon which Kadshe Kalim could be eaten, not in denigration of Kedushat Arei Mukafot Choma as Machne Yisrael, but acknowledging the special status of Yerushalayim. So in sum, according to the Rash, the reason one has to remove Mitzorim from Arei Mukafot Choma is because of an equivalency of Machne Yisrael as applicable to Arei Mukafot Choma in the same way as it's applicable to Yerushalayim, and therefore, when we look at the kedusha of Arei Mukafot Choma, it has the same source, meaning it emanates from Kadshe Kadashim out, from Kadshe Kadashim to the Azara, to Har HaBayis, to Yerushalayim, and other aspects of Machne Yisrael, which is Arei Mukafot Choma. Rav Lichtenstein then presented a contrasting approach that he found in the Rishonim, which is in the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Bias Hamikdash, Perek Gimel, says as follows: V'chei mitzora shenichnas Yerushalayim loka. A mitzora who enters into Yerushalayim is chayiv malkos because he violates in the Sidiraisa. Aval im nichnas l'shar ayarim Mukafot Choma, afal pisheno rashai, lefi shenemar badad yeshev, eno loka. But the Isser of Malchus does not apply to Ayarot Mukafot Choma. So Rav Lichtenstein breaks this down into its constituent parts. First, Yerushalayim, a mitzora, you receive Malchus because you violated Isser D'Oraisa, Lo Yavo El Tochaman Chaneh. with respect to a Metzora in Ari Mukafot Choma, you do not violate the Isser. So therefore you have to conclude that Ayarot's Mukafot Choma from the Rambam's perspective is not Machne Yisrael. There is no equivalency between Yerushalayim and Ayarot's Mukafot Choma. And then you come to the third question. If that's the case, why is there a din of Metzora that applies to Ayarot's Mukafot Choma? So there the Rambam says there is no Isser. There's this a mitzvah saseh of Badad Yeshev. A Metzora in Parshas Tizri Metzora, it says a Metzora must exit. The only question is, exit from where? Exit from a tent city? Exit from a regular city? So here the Rambam says, no, the type of place, the Badad Yeshev, where a mitzvah saseh, where the Metzora has to exit, what is that? That's Yerushalayim and Arei Mukafot Choma. Those are the only places there's a chiyuv d'oraisa of the Metzora to leave. So this is a fundamentally different conception. Therefore, what this is, before we get there, Rav Lichtenstein said in a moment of intellectual integrity, he said it's hard to take it fully that way, because the Mishnah speaks of Ayarot Mukafot Choma Mekudeshes Mimena. So it does speak of a certain Kedusha. So he suggests that either it's totally divorced from the idea of special Kedusha, or one can argue there is a Kedusha of Ayarot Mukafot Choma, but it's not Machne Yisrael. Because if it were Machne Yisrael, there would be Malchus, you would violate the Yisur D'Oraisa. So at this point, what we have is two fundamentally different conceptions, because it's not a minor issue, it's a directional issue. It's the Kedusha that requires, if we're going to say it's Kedusha, that requires the Metzora to depart, has nothing to do with Mikdash. It's totally separate and apart from Mikdash. Really two different conceptual understandings. Then Rav Lichtenstein presents, finally, a third and quite radical approach of the Gra. The Gra notes that the Tosefta, when quoting our Mishnah of Shiluach Mitzarim, quotes it in the name of Rav Menachem bar Yossi. And the Gra then infers from that Tanakama, Chachamim, actually disagree. Meaning what? So now it's a machlokas between the halacha that is quoted with respect to Metzora having to leave and Ari Mukafot Choma as a das yachid, according to the Gra. And therefore, Shiluach Mitzarim, according to the majority opinion, according to the Gra, there is no halacha. The halacha only applies to Yerushalayim. And when you think about that, that's against the Rash, because the Rash says, Ari Mukafot Choma Ar Machne Yisrael. And if the Gra's reading him of his reading of the Tosefta is correct, but the idea that the Tosefta and the inference he takes that this is a minority view, if the Gra is correct, there is no concept of Machne Yisrael being extended beyond Yerushalayim, and therefore he disagrees with the Rash. On the other hand, he also is against the Rambam, because there's no special status whatsoever. There's no need of Badad Yeshev except within Yerushalayim, and therefore we have a totally third position. The only din of Machne Yisrael, there's only a din of Machne Yisrael in Yerushalayim, and therefore there's only a halacha of Shiluach Mitzaros with respect to Yerushalayim. There is no special status with respect to Ari Mukafot Choma and Metzora. The only thing is, of course, the only time we mention Ari Mukafot Choma in what's called in Torah Sheb'Ksav relates to a special halacha with respect to redemption of a home. That there's a much broader market within within urban cities, and houses can be sold without being subject to Shemitah. That's the only, and there's a 1-year look back, and that's it. Other than that, there's no mention in the Torah, and there's no other halacha with respect to Metzora. This also solves a separate problem. The Mishnah suggests that the Mishnah states that there are Eser Kedushos. There are 10 Kedushos in Eretz Yisrael. It then lists 11. Okay. And according to this, the Gemara just quotes, it takes Ayarot Mukafot Choma, and all of a sudden we solve that problem. The bigger problem is that the Rambam clearly paskins that there is a concept of Ayarot Mukafot Choma, and its understanding. But now we have 3 different positions. Position of the Rash, that Ayarot Mukafot Choma are considered Machane Yisrael, so equivalent to the status of Yerushalayim, or according to the Mabit, equal, meaning both on the affirmative and the negative side. The Rambam says there is no equivalence between Yerushalayim and Ayarot Mukafot Choma and Yerushalayim. It's not Machane Yisrael, and Shiluach Mitzarim is rooted in Badad Yeshev, the mitzvah saseh. Okay, and the third position is position of the Gra, that there is no concept with Ayarot Mukafot Choma being applicable with respect to Mitzarim. The Lichtenstein then takes and applies these principles, and then the truth is that the discussion is too subtle and complex to be summarized easily. But at least in one aspect, I want to point out this issue of directionality that we spoke of. Is Ayarot Mukafot Choma rooted in an extension of Kodesh Kodashim, or is it just a special halacha relating to Metzora, or related to Yovel, which means it's coming from what? It's coming from the side of Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael is Kadosh, and Ayarot Mukafot Choma is more Kadosh, as opposed to Kodesh Kodashim is Kadosh, and there's lesser and lesser Kedusha. Is it an intensification of Eretz Yisrael, or is it a diminishment of what comes from Kodesh Kodashim outside? It depends. When we look at this issue of where it emanates from, it actually can have many, many ramifications as to how we apply it. In the article's final section, Rav Lichtenstein discusses a Gemara and Brachos and a Rashi that mentions Ayarot Mukafot Choma in a very specific place. He then quotes a Chiddush of the Rav, which it's one of the responses that makes a distinction between Batei Ir Choma and Shulo Chavodim with respect to with respect to Arei Choma. And he basically develops a concept that Kedushat Eretz Yisrael can be in full force, and Yovel can be in full force, and Arei Mukafot Choma can be in full force, but the practical aspect of Yovel would not be applicable unless Bias Kulchem was applied. It's going to obviously be way too long to actually adjudicate that specific discussion. If you wish to dedicate time to opening up the Kedushat Aviv and understanding its uniqueness, I strongly recommend you read the first article on Hilchos Shabbos. I heard that shir 45 years ago. And it has had, it's an impact on the way that I relate to Shabbos and Yom Tov at all times. However, if you're going to only have time for a 10-page article, and you're trying to get an outstanding model of Rav Lichtenstein's methodology, that this is a great article. This is really a wonderful article. You watch him search for the conceptual basis of understanding of a halacha through his mining of Rishonim, in this case the Rash and the Rambam, he presents a coherent picture of even obscure topics like this in an identical presentation he does to the more familiar topics. And he scans all of Torah Shabbat in a way that is breathtaking, but with great ease in the way he presents it, in expanding our view of of what we thought was a narrow topic. Thank you very much.